Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Literate Discussions. I'm M. David Hornbuckle, and today our guest is Jason Kesler, a writer who also teaches at the University of West Georgia. Welcome, Jason. We're here today to talk about A Rose for Emily
Yeah,
by William Faulkner.
sure.
I remember reading this story in 9th or 10th grade in my English class.
Yeah, high school.
And and was pretty blown away by it then, and then I had to read some other Faulkner later on in 11th grade. I think we read As I Lay Dying, and then I just became obsessed. Like I read everything I could get my hands on by him over the next couple of years. I'm not in my office right now, but if I were in my office, you'd see a giant framed picture of William Faulkner, like right behind my desk. Yeah, so he's my guy. But tell me about your relationship with this story.
As far as Faulkner's work in full, I have sort of a love-hate relationship with him. He was writing primarily during the sort of the high modernism where, being experimental and trying new things was sort of almost seemed like of the utmost importance. And some of his experiments. So, I've read As I Lay Dying, and I've read that several times now. The first time I read it, I was just sort of like, what the hell's going on here? And this is something we can talk about with the story itself, A Rose for Emily. The narrative perspective that he seems in that novel to set up, every section has a character's name, and you think that you're reading the story from that character's perspective. But as you get into that novel, you realize that this character could not have known this fact or wasn't there to witness this event. Just that experimental nature and Faulkner wanting to make the reader uncomfortable. I mean, obviously, I was uncomfortable. Yeah. And at first, I was sort of rejecting the feeling of being uncomfortable. It wasn't until I read Absalom that I felt like his whole sort of approach, that whole experimental approach, particularly in terms of the narrative sort of perspective, until that really caught on with me and really galvanized my interest in rereading his work and studying him. And that kind of
I think about it as kind of an early metafiction because it's a story about storytelling. Because really the way the story emerges and gets put together is ultimately more interesting and more important in that book than the details of the story itself.
Right. It's an interactive type of storytelling where you get to choose what's important. I mean, I guess we all do that as readers anyway, but for that particular piece, it's highly interactive.
All right. So getting back to A Rose for Emily, there is an interesting narrative structure to this story.
Right.
Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. The use of the first person plural narrator. So I've read it several times with that in mind. This go around reading it for the discussion, I was really intent on wanting to understand exactly who the we is in the story. It's always explained that the we is the community, that there's this community as narrator. But obviously the community, the we that we're given is a certain segment of the community.
Right. It can't be the whole community because the community is not a monolith.
Right? No, exactly. Right. So I was, as I was reading this time, I was trying to decipher who is that we. It's obviously not the black people in the community because of the way that Toby is sort of identified as the Negro man again and again and again. But it's also not the white authority, the official authority figures of the community, because usually they're identified as a they by this we narrator. It's also not the new generation. So the new generation is mentioned several times in the story, which seems to make the new generation of, Jeffersonians, the city in which the story takes place, Jefferson. The we does not include them. So the we for me becomes, the older generation, those who are not authority figures. They're not, the alderman. They're not the mayor, the judge. They're in the older generation who, seems to be obsessed with what Emily sort of represents for them.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of imagine like a group of old ladies at the A&P kind of
Yeah.
gossiping to each other about,
Uh-huh.
What's been going on at Miss Emily's house,
Right.
all these years.
Exactly.
And
You see it. There is a reference in the story, a passing joke that I think the narrator, Faulkner, is making about Emily. This setup that Colonel Sartoris makes about her not having to pay taxes, and this story that he, develops, and that only a woman would be willing to accept the veracity of this story about why Miss Emily shouldn't have to pay taxes. You imagining the narrator, the we, as this group of old ladies, who are, getting together in this sort of coffee clatch and talking about the latest gossip. That's interesting, just because of that little nugget of information there. And this story was published in 1930, I think.
I think that's right.
I read one of his first publications in a reputable magazine.
Yeah, it was pretty early for him.
Yeah. And so even then he was, interested in playing with narrative structure. This short story has many, if not most, of the hallmarks of what a reader would expect when entering any Faulkner story. You've got that interesting narrative perspective, questions about who the narrator is, or in this story are.
You have the fictional town of Jefferson in Yaxpatawpha County.
Yeah.
And all the sort of stock characters that come along with that are part of the Faulkner universe in all of his books.
Yeah. So I mentioned Colonel Sartoris, who briefly gets mentioned in this story, but there's one of his early novels, The Unvanquished, I think it's called, which this story, A Rose for Emily, uses that word vanquished, that Emily was able to vanquish the city sort of aldermen, the authority figures. That just sort of brought back to mind that novel, The Unvanquished. And Colonel Sartoris has a much bigger role to play in that novel.
Right.
So you see characters that you're going to see in different novels and other short stories that Faulkner writes. So setting, place is important in this particular story, but also his what he does with time. And as you mentioned, sort of how he structures, how he arranges the narrative. We're always sort of going back and forth in time. As a reader, you have to really participate in putting these events in their chronological order to try to make sense of what's going on. But there was an interesting, towards the end of the story, where Miss Emily has died and everyone's coming to the house to sort of, pay their respects to her. And we have a paragraph about the old Confederate soldiers who show up, and Faulkner, describes their relationship with time is different than what the newer generation might expect about what does the past mean for them? And for them, it's not this diminishing road, but it's this, the image I get is this this huge pack that everything that's happened to them gets stuffed into it. And so they're not seeing the events of their life in terms of, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. They're just seeing all that as a collection of events that just get tangled up together.
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting observation, and especially given, Faulkner obviously was very critical of what he called the great sin of the South, of being slavery, and felt that what happened to the South after the Civil War was basically the atonement, for that. And but there's always a sense, not just in Faulkner's work, but in the South in general,
Yeah.
that that we kind of walk among ghosts, and that like the past is always with us. The past, that we're always living in it, and those Confederate soldiers in the story are really the embodiment of that idea.
In some ways, it made me start thinking, if we jump back to the who's the we, I felt like at one point the we are the ghosts. They're these beings that are out of time and place, and they're just sort of they're this sort of like ghostly Greek chorus who is there to, just again to comment and to carry on the stories of the past, and to keep these characters, I don't know, just to keep up with these characters that they would have known in their past lives. I don't know, it was a weird thought for me.
No, but that makes sense too. I mean, I think that's a valid theory, as valid as the coffee clutch,
Sure. I feel like with obviously the present tense events that are happening in the life of our nation right now, that sense that the past is immediate, that the past is present in our lives, and it's something that we can stuff into a sack and pretend that it's, behind our backs and we can not have to deal with it, That's something that is also a feature of Faulkner being uncomfortable for me as a reader, besides just the technical stuff about, narrative perspective and setting, but, issues of race, issues of gender, of class, particularly in the South. That baggage is with us as not just readers, but as
it's in our life.
Yeah, and not just Southerners, right? So the thing that I think that we have to learn as a nation is that slavery and the racism, the social injustices that have grown out of that it's not a Southern thing, right? It's a national thing, and in some ways we're seeing that it's an international thing that we all have to reckon with, and that we have to find a way to communicate with the ghosts in our own communities, and I don't know, find some way to live, to either lay the ghosts or to live among the ghosts. It's it's very difficult. It's a very difficult endeavor to be a human being.
It's a difficult time to be a human being. That's for sure.
I guess Faulkner was wanting us to, in his fiction, he was wanting us to feel that, particularly Southern literature. He was writing at a time where Southern literature, for most people, was the stereotypes. We make fun of the yokel and the uneducated, and certainly
Either that or it was glorifying the antebellum period, like Gone with the Wind, right?
Yes, and certainly Faulkner deals with those tropes in his fiction, but he's wanting to show us that being a Southerner is more than just that. There is that aspect to our culture, but it's more than just that. And so he wants to complicate things. He wants to give us things that will make us uncomfortable, give us things to think about.
Absolutely.
And I think that's good.
Yeah, I agree.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks for spending some time on Zoom with me.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. All right. See you later. Bye.
Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.